lovely way to have a cup of coffee, and Professor Tony Holmes AO popped in, and feel like a cup of coffee, don't you?
I certainly do, and just call me Tony.
Tony, look, it's just terrific to have a chat to you about some of the things you've done in life, and I don't sort of want to go through the CV minute by minute, hour by hour, or we'd need many, many hours, but what was the inspiration to get into the medical profession, to actually sit down with someone at some stage and say, you know what, I'd like to be a doctor?
Well, it was my mother. I came from a poor family, and I think my mother always wanted me to be a doctor. And when I was, for my 12th birthday, she gave me a book called Men with Golden Hands, written by a fellow called Lund, who was an Austrian. It was translated from the German, and I read everything and I loved it. But I think she knew what she was doing.
And you thought, I'll become a man with a golden hand?
I'd like to be a man with the golden hands. I wasn't planning to be a surgeon per se, because I was actually a bit squeamish.
Is it just an urban myth, but you were actually not thrilled with the sight of blood?
No, it's true. It's absolutely true. I found it difficult that we had anatomy school back in those days, so you go in and literally learn anatomy for a year or two on cadavers, and
that's real.
These are real people, and that was still uncomfortable for me. But once we really got into the hospital situation, in particular doing post-mortems and things like that, I had to stand at the back. I didn't want to see it. I was quite squeamish.
Is there a way that they can help? I'm thinking of medical students today who go, look, I'm absolutely focused on what I'm going to do, but this is something I've got to cope with.
The interest takes over.
Yeah.
The moment you become interested, then it takes over. But yeah, I was heading to be a physician rather than a surgeon, because I thought, you know, surgeons were guys who wear gumboots and sweat a lot, and physicians were the sort of Sherlock Holmeses that use their brains, and I wanted to be clever, but I wasn't really. I was just someone who liked to use his hands.
In the early days, Tony, there was New Guinea and Timor and some challenges there.
Yes, part of the rotations that I had from the Royal Melbourne Hospital, where I was training, were to New Guinea, and I guess the Royal Melbourne Hospital thought it was pretty good, and I thought it was pretty good, and I thought I could handle everything. But you go into a country like that, and all of a sudden you're faced with things that you hadn't seen before. Severe burns, deformed children, things like that, and that really brought me back to earth.
In what way?
Well, I thought, you know, what I was doing, learning at the Royal Melbourne, that would be very straightforward, whereas in New Guinea I had to really think, well, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to repair a child with a cleft lip or a deformity, or deal with bad burns, and these were the common things there. If someone got a major hand injury or a leg injury in New Guinea, their life was pretty much finished. They couldn't earn a living or get food and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that made me change the way I was looking, and I was working at the Royal Melbourne with some really wonderful surgeons who sort of enthused me, and one of them were in the plastic surgery unit, where they reconstructed, because a lot of general surgery back then was cutting things out, draining something, or cutting it off.
What we lay people think of is the day-to-day operations. The
day-to-day operations, and reconstructive surgery is making things, and that's what I like to do, so make things.
And that's a lovely way of putting it. And you are facing some of the toughest times with the people you see. They come in as a patient from all parts of the world. How do you handle the emotion, first of all, before we get into the actual medical side, that it's just so sad when you see them initially, or is it the hope that you know you can do something?
Well, I think no, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is sad, and you have to put yourself in the patient's and their parents' position, and then try and explain that to them, but also know what you can't do and what you can do, and make sure that you get that across to them clearly. But yes, it is hard, but interestingly enough, children are the best patients because they don't have any emotional overlay. Adults are scared because they know things, they've heard things, whereas children are believing and trusting, and they actually make the best patients. I really enjoy treating children. They are terrific patients.
And some of them would probably just accept the way that they are, with the sadness of abnormalities within their face and their head and everything. But then to go that next stage when the operation is complete and successful.
Yes. What's interesting is that children with deformities grow up in many ways more resilient than normal children. They get a lot of support from the doctors, their parents, and they're just generally a bit tougher. And then when you see them get through and how they deal with life, they do very well. Whereas quite often the normal children who don't have anything wrong are very worried by their appearance, their body image. The social media doesn't help.
No.
And in fact, there's evidence to show that their body image index is less than some of these children that are born with major deformities, which is a very interesting and somewhat disturbing fact.
The Melbourne procedure was revolutionary. You're ahead of your time. Explain what that was all about, or what it is about.
Oh, that's fairly complex. So I'm a craniofacial surgeon, so I tend to deal with children's deformities that involve the craniofacial skeleton. And part of that is that certain children are born where the sutures of their head, their skull, fuse early. Now, all of us, when we're born, need to have flexible sutures, first of all to get out the birth passage, but secondly, the brain is expanding very rapidly in a child. And so having the bones not fused together allows the brain to expand. But there are some diseases where the sutures fuse early, and then the brain cannot expand in that region.
It's trapped.
It's trapped. And this fusion is usually in utero, so this is before you're even born. So the brain can't develop properly. And we know this because when these children are born, and if we follow them through, a lot of them have cognitive defects, learning difficulties, and frankly some develop raised pressure, which is life-threatening. So the early treatment for this many years ago, once it was recognised and surgery was possible, I mean, if it wasn't possible and they had raised pressure, well, they died. But the early surgery was to release that suture. But it then refused because that was the disease that they had. It refused. So then surgeons tried everything, even wrapping plastic around the edges of the bone when they were operating so they couldn't join together. But the body knew better. It actually made new bone between the plastic bits. And it still caused the fusion.
So you had to work out, how can we overcome this?
Yes, and it wasn't worked out by me, it was worked out by some pioneering surgeons, but usually in the early 20th century, how to actually make bigger cuts and start shifting the bones to where they should have been had this not happened, all in one operation. And the major pioneers for that were from France, actually. A fellow called Paul Tessier, who was the pioneer of craniofacial surgery. and Daniel Marshak, another person from Paris, who was the pioneer of actually operating on early infants, which I was particularly interested in. I was fortunate enough to be able to work with both of these people, and we brought the techniques back to Melbourne, when I came back from America in 1978. And there were multiple techniques, and we couldn't really find the right one. And then one day I was doing one of the ones invented by a fellow called Jane, that was his surname, and it wasn't quite working the way. It's a sort of technique where you take out a whole lot of the bone and then you change the shape by bending the bone at the back of the head and bringing it forward. So instead of having a long head, you wanted a short head that was wide. And the bit at the back snapped off.
Oh.
Oh.
Problem?
What do I do now? Well, I brought it forward anyway, and it left a huge gap at the back, but what it didn't do was leave pressure on the brain. I thought, well, hang on, that's sitting beautifully. If we just fill in with the bits of bone that I took out at the back, that would look good. And we did that, and the kid looked terrific. Everything was fantastic, and this was 1999.
Yeah.
And so we went back and started drawing, how can we do this and everything, and drew up this sort of plan and did it. And it really worked incredibly well. It made an instant brain space that we needed and a good-looking normal head. And so we did a few, and it
worked.
It really worked. And then, so eventually in 2008, we published it. And then we've kept on doing it, made a few minor modifications. So we're now 20 years down the line since that was started, and we've
it was done here?
Yeah, done over 300, and the reoperation rate for this is, for any reason, is less than 1%, which is lower than any
That's fantastic.
technique, and the kids are all growing up normally. And we have a few that didn't have the operation because the parents didn't want it, or they didn't recognise the disease or whatever.
They're probably not with us.
Well, no, but of those, at least 50% came to emergency surgery later on in life, usually around about 8 or 9 years old, because of brain pressure. So that was the Melbourne technique. And there are other techniques around, but so far, from our point of view, getting good results with one operation, never having to do it again, and bringing all these children into the normal mental mainstream has been a good thing. So
what you're telling me, Tony, is sometimes it will happen. It's as simple as that you're doing something, it works in the theatre, you take the team out, you sit down there with a pen and paper.
Absolutely.
And decide this is why it worked, and if we can continue this.
That's David, that's serendipity in medicine.
Yeah.
I mean, penicillin was discovered because Fleming noticed a gap around a mould, and said, "Why is that happening?" And then went back and changed it. And a lot of discoveries are made in medicine because people observe something that they weren't actually looking at that particular problem, but they observed something different and then thought laterally and said, hang on, why don't we do that? That sounds like a good idea. And that sort of serendipity in medicine is a major thing. But
innovation.
But you've got to have innovation, but you've also got to have a prepared mind.
An open mind.
An open mind.
With that in mind, I'll do the double whammy here. We're talking about the dollar, and every dollar that's given to the Royal Children's Hospital, I feel, is used really, really well. It's an amazing Good Friday appeal. It's an amazing hospital.
Yep.
From somebody who spends so much of your life there, how good is it?
I think it is a marvellous institution, and there's something special about doctors who go into paediatrics. From my point of view, that they have a slightly different attitude on life, and it's a lovely environment to be working in because everybody's really focused on doing the best for kids. So you actually enjoy being in that environment. And it's yes, it is well supported by the public, and because we all have children, and they're the most important things in our lives. And I think that is why it's such a good institution. Plus, it's I think it's intellectually honest as well, and I've really enjoyed working there. Interestingly, it was only late in my surgical training that I had anything to do with children.
Sure.